"You'll be sorry, I won't bow to you," the war-claim widow warned when the Choctaw hunter paid $3 for her at the auction. The sun hammered down on Bitter Creek like judgment itself, turning the dust to powder and the air to fire. At the edge of the settlement square, beneath a crooked cottonwood that offered no shade worth mentioning, a woman stood on a crude platform of splintered pine boards, her wrists bound with fraying hemp rope, her face streaked with dirt and dried blood from a split lip. Yet her eyes burned with something fiercer than the noon heat, a defiance that made grown men look away. The crowd gathered thick, boots scuffing the hard-packed earth, voices rising in cruel jest and mockery. "She's nothing but trouble," one man shouted, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "War took her husband and left her mean as a rattler," another called out, drawing laughter from those pressed close to the platform. The auctioneer, a rail-thin man with a face like old leather and teeth stained brown from years of chewing plug, raised his hand for silence. "Now, gentlemen," he drawled, "we got ourselves a fine piece of property here. Strong back, young enough to bear children, comes with a land claim deed from her dead husband's service. Who'll start the bidding at $5? Silence fell like a stone down a well. Men shifted their weight, studied their boots, pretended sudden interest in the horizon. $5 was good money, more than most would spend on a horse that hadn't been broken yet. The auctioneer's smile faltered. $4 then. Still nothing. The woman on the platform lifted her chin higher, and though her hands were bound, her voice cut through the quiet like a blade through silk. "Save your breath," she said coldly. "They know I'm worth nothing to cowards." A ripple of anger moved through the crowd. One man stepped forward, thick-shouldered and red-faced, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "You best watch that mouth, widow, or we'll see it shut permanent." The auctioneer raised both hands, nervous now, sweat beading on his upper lip. Now, let's keep this civil. Do I hear $3? $3 for the woman and the land claim both." That's when the voice came from the back of the crowd, low and steady as distant thunder. $3. Every head turned. Through the press of bodies stepped a man who moved like water over stone, silent and certain. He was Choctaw, that much was clear from the cut of his features, and the midnight black of his hair that fell past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather. He wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt faded to the color of old bone, a hunting knife sheathed at his belt, a rifle slung across his back. His face was unreadable, weathered by sun and wind, marked by a thin scar that ran from his left cheekbone to his jaw. The crowd parted as he approached, some out of respect, most out of unease. Choctaw weren't common this far west, not since the removals had scattered the tribes like seeds on hard ground. The auctioneer's eyes narrowed, calculating. $3, he repeated slowly. "You got that in coin, not promises." The man reached into a leather pouch at his belt and drew out $3 silver, setting them one by one on the edge of the platform with deliberate care. The metal rang clear in the stillness. The auctioneer snatched up the coins, bit one to test its authenticity, then nodded with satisfaction. "Sold to the Indian for $3. The woman and the land deed both." He turned to pull a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, thrusting it toward the buyer. "She's your problem now," he added with a smirk. "Good luck keeping her from cutting your throat in your sleep." The Choctaw hunter, whose name was Halito Pushmataha, though no one in Bitter Creek knew it yet, ignored the auctioneer completely. He stepped onto the platform, drawing his knife in one smooth motion. The woman didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just watched him with those burning eyes as he cut through the rope binding her wrists. The hemp fell away, and she rubbed the raw skin beneath, her gaze never leaving his face. "You'll be sorry," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made it sound like prophecy. "I won't bow to you." Halito's expression didn't change. He folded the knife back into its sheath and spoke for the second time, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent, that marked him as a man who'd learned English as a second tongue. "I didn't buy you to make you bow," he said simply. "I bought you because they would have." He turned and walked off the platform, not looking back to see if she would follow. For a moment, Evelyn Townsend, the war-claimed widow whose husband had died screaming at Shiloh 3 years past, stood frozen. Every instinct told her to run, to fight, to spit in the face of this stranger who'd bought her like livestock. But something in his words, in the way he'd turned his back as if trusting she wouldn't put a knife between his shoulder blades, gave her pause. She looked at the crowd, at the leering faces and hard eyes, at the auctioneer already counting his commission, and she made her choice. She stepped down from the platform and followed. Bitter Creek was a settlement that had grown up around nothing and was determined to return to it. Wooden buildings leaned against each other like drunks after a long night, their paint peeling in long strips, their windows clouded with dust and grime. The main street, if it could be called that, was little more than a wide space between structures where wagons could turn around without getting stuck. At one end stood a saloon that never closed, at the other a general store that sold more whiskey than flour. In between were a blacksmith's shop, a livery stable, a boarding house that rented rooms by the hour, and a dozen other establishments of equally questionable repute. Halito walked through it all with the easy confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was going and didn't care who noticed. Evelyn followed 3 paces behind, her jaw set, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. People stared, whispered, pointed. "The Choctaw and his new property," they said. "Wonder how long before she kills him. Wonder how long before he wishes she had," at the far edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrub brush and rocky ground, stood a small adobe structure with a thatched roof and a corral out back. 2 horses stood in the shade of a lean-to, their tails swishing at flies. Halito opened the door and gestured inside. "You can sleep here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we leave." Evelyn stopped in the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the dimness within. The interior was sparse but clean, a bedroll in one corner, a few cooking implements near a small hearth, saddles and gear hanging from pegs on the wall. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice flat. "And why should I follow you anywhere?" Halito turned to face her fully for the first time since leaving the auction. In the shadows his eyes were dark as river stones, but there was something in them that wasn't cruelty, wasn't ownership, wasn't any of the things she'd expected to see. "North," he said. "To the territory beyond the Red River. There's land there, unclaimed, where a person can start again." He paused, then added, "Your husband's claim deed is worthless here. The men who run Bitter Creek will take it from you the moment I'm gone. But in the North, with the right words to the right people, it might be worth something." She studied him, searching for the lie, the trap, the hidden blade. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "What do you get out of this?" "Nothing," he said simply. "Maybe that's the point." He moved past her to check the horses, leaving her standing in the doorway with more questions than answers. Evelyn looked back at Bitter Creek, at the dust and decay and desperate men who called it home, then at the open land beyond. For the first time in 3 years, since the day the letter had come telling her Thomas Townsend had died in a surgeon's tent with half his chest blown away, she felt something other than rage or despair. She felt the faintest stirring of possibility. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood, Evelyn stepped inside the adobe and let the door close behind her. Halito glanced up from where he was checking the cinches on a saddle, gave a small nod, and returned to his work. Neither spoke. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of dust and distance, of a world larger than the small cruel corner they'd both been trapped in. Somewhere in that wind was the promise of something different, though whether it would be better or worse remained to be seen. Night fell over Bitter Creek like a blanket soaked in oil, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn sat near the small hearth where Halito had built a modest fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the adobe walls. He'd given her a tin cup of water and a piece of dried meat, which she'd accepted without thanks, still wary, still waiting for the other boot to drop. Across the fire, Halito sat cross-legged, working oil into a leather strap with patient circular motions. His face unreadable in the flickering light. "Why $3?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for over an hour. He didn't look up from his work. "Because that's what I had," he said. She shook her head. "No, I mean why anything at all? Why not just let them have me?" Now he did look up, his dark eyes meeting hers across the fire. "Because I know what it means to be sold," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with history and pain. "My people were moved west 30 years ago, packed onto boats and marched like cattle. Many died. Those who survived were scattered. I was 7 years old. I watched my mother die of fever on the trail. My father lived another 5 years before whiskey took him. By then I'd learned to hunt, to track, to survive alone." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the knot of anger she'd carried so tightly. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Halito gave a small shrug. "The past can't be changed. Only what comes next." He set aside the leather strap and reached into his pack, pulling out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a piece of cornbread and some dried berries. He offered half to her. "Eat," he said. "Tomorrow we ride before dawn." She took the food, this time with a nod of acknowledgement. They ate in silence, the fire burning low. Outside, the sounds of Bitter Creek filtered through the thin walls. Drunken laughter from the saloon, the crack of a pistol shot, someone screaming curses into the night. It was a place that bred violence and despair in equal measure. And Evelyn had been drowning in it since the war had made her a widow at 23, when the food was gone. Halito stood and moved to the door, checking the latch. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." She wanted to argue, to insist she didn't need protection, but exhaustion pulled at her like an undertow. She moved to the bedroll he'd laid out for her, noticed he'd given her the better blanket, the one without holes. As she lay down, she heard him settle near the door, his rifle across his knees. Sleep came slowly, and with it, dreams. She dreamed of Thomas, of his laugh and his rough hands, and the way he'd promised to come home. She dreamed of the letter, of the words that had shattered her world. "Regret to inform you. Died bravely. Honored his country." Empty words that filled no empty beds, that bought no food, that paid no debts. When she'd tried to claim the land deed he'd earned through service, the officials in Bitter Creek had laughed in her face. A woman alone had no rights, they'd said. Best thing she could do was find another husband, or sell herself to the highest bidder. She woke before dawn to find Halito already moving about, packing supplies with quiet efficiency. He'd left another cup of water beside her bedroll and a strip of dried venison. She ate quickly, then stood and began rolling up the blanket. "What can I carry?" she asked. He glanced at her, seemed to measure something in her stance, then nodded toward a smaller pack. "That one. It has food and medicine. Don't lose it." They loaded the horses as the first gray light began to seep across the eastern sky. Bitter Creek was still asleep, or as close to sleep as such a place ever got. Halito handed Evelyn the reins to a sturdy mare, a gray with kind eyes and a calm temperament. "She's yours now," he said. "Her name is Taya. It means precious in my language." Evelyn ran her hand along the mare's neck, feeling the warmth of living muscle beneath her palm. "Thank you," she said softly. They rode out as the sun broke over the horizon, turning the desert into a sea of gold and shadow. Halito led the way, his bearing easy in the saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead. Evelyn followed, her body remembering the rhythm of riding from childhood days on her father's farm, days that seemed like someone else's life now. The land stretched endlessly before them, broken only by distant mesas and the occasional twisted Joshua tree reaching toward the sky like a prophet in prayer. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, the sun a white hammer beating down without mercy. They stopped in the shade of an outcropping to let the horses drink from their canteens. Water poured into Halito's hat. Evelyn watched him tend to the animals with gentle efficiency, speaking to them in Choctaw, words she didn't understand but whose meaning was clear enough. "How far north?" she asked, wiping sweat from her forehead. 3 weeks if the weather holds," he said. 4 if it doesn't. There are places to resupply along the way, settlements friendlier than Bitter Creek, and there are places we'll need to avoid. He straightened, looking toward the northern horizon. Men who claim to uphold law but serve only their own greed. Other men who serve no law at all. The land between here and there is not kind. She met his gaze steadily. "I've survived worse than unkind land," she said. He nodded slowly, and she thought she saw the ghost of respect flicker in his eyes. "I believe you," he said. "That's why I think you'll make it." They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape changing gradually from flat desert to rolling hills studded with juniper and scrub oak. As evening approached, Halito guided them to a sheltered spot between 2 rock formations, where a thin stream trickled over smooth stones. They made camp there, Halito building a small fire while Evelyn tended the horses. The routine was falling into place between them, unspoken but understood. As darkness settled and the stars began to emerge like silver dust scattered across black velvet, Evelyn sat by the fire and finally asked the question that had been gnawing at her all day. "What's your name?" she said. "Your real name, not just what I should call you." He looked at her across the flames, considering. "Halito Pushmataha," he said. "It means welcome warrior in the language of my people. My father gave me that name because I was born on the day peace was made between our clan and another. He thought I would be a bridge between worlds." "And are you?" she asked. He smiled, but it was a sad smile, the smile of a man who'd tried to build bridges only to watch them burn. "I try," he said. "That's all anyone can do." She nodded, then offered her own truth. "My name is Evelyn Townsend. I was Evelyn Crane before I married. My husband called me Evie. He said it made me sound less serious." She paused, staring into the fire. "I haven't been called that since he died." Halito fed another stick to the flames. "Would you like to be called that again?" he asked gently. She thought about it, about the girl she'd been before the war, before widowhood, before Bitter Creek and the auction block. "No," she said finally. "That person is gone. I'm just Evelyn now." He accepted this with a nod, and they sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned down to coals. Above them, the sky wheeled slowly, constellations turning their ancient dance. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out, lonely and haunting. Another answered from a different direction. The sound made Evelyn think of all the lost souls crying out in the wilderness, searching for something they'd never find, before sleep took her. Wrapped in her blanket beneath the vast and different stars, Evelyn found herself thinking about the road ahead, about what lay beyond the horizon in that northern territory Halito spoke of. She thought about the land deed tucked in his saddlebag, the piece of paper that represented her dead husband's service, his sacrifice, his blood. Maybe it would be worth something there. Maybe she could build something new. Or maybe she would simply survive, which was more than she'd managed to do in Bitter Creek. Across the dying fire, Halito sat with his back against stone. His rifle closed, his eyes half closed but not sleeping. Never quite sleeping. He'd learned long ago that the world was not safe. That trust was a luxury few could afford. That survival meant staying alert even when exhaustion pulled at you like an anchor dragging you down. But he'd also learned that sometimes, just sometimes, taking a risk on another person was worth it. Not because it would be rewarded, but because it was right. The night deepened. and the desert around them settled into that profound silence that comes only in wild places far from human habitation. In that silence, two people who'd been broken by different cruelties, shaped by different sorrows, began the long, slow work of learning to exist in each other's presence without fear. It wasn't trust yet, not even close, but it was a beginning. And in a world as hard as theirs, beginnings were enough. The second day brought them into canyon country, where red stone walls rose like the ribs of some ancient sleeping giant. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, tinged with sage and the mineral scent of rock heated by the sun. Halito led them through narrow passages where the horses' hooves echoed off stone, creating a rhythm that sounded almost like drums. Evelyn found herself watching the way he moved, the certainty in his choices at each fork in the path, as if he were reading a map written in the land itself that only he could see. They stopped near midday at a place where a natural spring bubbled up from between two boulders, forming a small pool before disappearing back into the earth. The water was so clear, Evelyn could see every pebble at the bottom, could watch tiny silver fish darting between the rocks. Halito dismounted and knelt beside the pool, cupping water in his hands to drink. "It's safe," he said, noticing her hesitation. "This spring has fed travelers for generations." She knelt beside him, the coolness of the water shocking against her sun-heated skin. She drank deeply, then splashed her face and neck, feeling days of dust and sweat wash away. When she looked up, she caught Halito watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just thinking you're stronger than those men in Bitter Creek gave you credit for. Most people raised soft wouldn't have made it this far without complaint." "I wasn't raised soft," she said, an edge creeping into her voice. "My father was a farmer in Missouri. I could plow a field, birth a calf, and shoot a rabbit for supper before I was 12. The war didn't make me weak, it just made me alone." "There's a difference." Halito stood, offering her his hand to help her up. She hesitated only a moment before taking it, his palm calloused and warm against hers. "I see that now," he said simply. "Come, we should keep moving. There's a place ahead where we can camp for the night, but we need to reach it before dark. The path gets dangerous after sunset." They rode on, the canyon walls growing higher and closer until in some places Evelyn could have reached out and touched both sides at once. The sun became a narrow strip of brightness far above, the shadows deep and cool. She found herself wondering how Halito knew this route, how many times he'd traveled it before, and why. But she didn't ask. Some questions could wait. As afternoon stretched toward evening, they emerged from the canyons onto a high plateau covered in dry grass that whispered secrets to the wind. In the distance, Evelyn could see the dark line of mountains, their peaks still touched with snow despite the season. The sight stirred something in her chest, a feeling she'd almost forgotten. Something like hope, or perhaps just the memory of what hope had once felt like. The place Halito had spoken of turned out to be the ruins of an old way station. Its walls mostly collapsed, but with enough structure remaining to provide shelter from the wind. A stone fireplace still stood intact in one corner, blackened by countless fires. Someone had been here recently, Evelyn noted, seeing the remnants of a camp. Ashes in the fireplace, a pile of firewood stacked neatly against the wall. Halito dismounted and immediately began checking the perimeter, his movements careful and deliberate. Evelyn watched him circle the ruins twice before he seemed satisfied. "We're not alone out here," he said, returning to where she stood with the horses. "But whoever was here last meant no harm. They left wood for the next traveler. That's a good sign." They set about making camp, falling into the rhythm they'd established the night before. Evelyn gathered more wood while Halito tended the horses and laid out their supplies. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, he built a fire in the old stone hearth. The flames caught quickly, hungry for the dry wood. and soon warmth began to push back the evening chill. Evelyn sat on a flat stone near the fire, watching Halito prepare a simple meal of beans and salt pork heated in a small iron pot. The smell made her stomach clench with hunger. When had she last eaten a proper meal, she wondered. Not since before Thomas died, probably. Not since she'd had a home instead of just places to survive in. Halito handed her a tin plate with food and a piece of hardtack. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, while he settled across from her with his own plate. For a while they ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of fire and the distant cry of a nightbird. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Tell me about where we're going. This Northern Territory. What makes you think it'll be any different than Bitter Creek?" He set down his plate and stared into the flames, gathering his thoughts. "After my father died," he began, "I wandered for years. Hunting, trapping, trading. I learned that most places are the same, just different faces on the same cruelty. But about 2 years ago, I guided a group of settlers through the Wichita Mountains. They were Quakers, people who believed in peace, in treating others fairly regardless of their skin or their past. They settled in the valley beyond the Red River, built a small community." He paused, poking the fire with a stick. "They invited me to stay, to build a house there, to be part of what they were making. I didn't, not then. I wasn't ready to stop moving, to trust that any place could be home. But I remembered it. And when I heard about the auction in Bitter Creek, about a widow being sold like property, I thought maybe that land deed of yours could be claimed there, in a place where people still believed in doing right." Evelyn absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. "And you think these Quakers will just accept us? A Choctaw hunter and a war widow with nothing but a piece of paper?" she asked. Halito met her gaze across the fire. "I think they'll give us a chance. That's more than most places offer. What we do with that chance is up to us." She nodded slowly, then asked the question that had been building in her since they left Bitter Creek. "Why did you really buy me, Halito? And don't say because you had $3. There's more to it than that." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "5 years ago, I had a wife. Her name was Ayanna. She was Chickasaw, beautiful and strong and kind. We lived in a small settlement near Fort Washita. One night, raiders came through, white men looking for easy targets. They took her. I tracked them for 3 weeks, but by the time I found their camp, she was already gone. They'd sold her to a brothel in Kansas. I got there too late. She'd taken her own life rather than live that way." The words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and choking. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, not for herself but for him, for the wife he'd lost, for the guilt he clearly carried. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Halito shook his head. "When I saw you on that platform, I saw her. I saw what I couldn't save. Maybe I can't make up for that failure, but I could at least stop it from happening again. Even once. Even to a stranger." Evelyn stood and moved around the fire to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You didn't fail her," she said firmly. "The men who took her failed. The world that let them failed. But you tried. And you're still trying. That's not failure, that's the opposite." He turned to look at her, and in the firelight she could see the moisture in his eyes, the first crack in the stoic mask he wore. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for understanding." They sat together in silence after that, watching the fire burn down to coals. Above them the stars emerged in their thousands, so many and so bright it seemed impossible that beneath such beauty, such cruelty could exist. But it did, Evelyn knew. It always had and probably always would. The only question was what you did in the face of it. Whether you added to the cruelty or tried, however imperfectly, to push back against it. Sleep came easier that night, wrapped in her blanket near the warmth of the dying fire, with Halito keeping watch as he always did. She dreamed of Thomas again, but this time the dream was different. He wasn't calling to her from the darkness, wasn't bleeding and broken. Instead, he was standing in a field of golden wheat, smiling, and when she tried to reach him, he shook his head gently. "Go on, Evie," he seemed to say without words. "Go on, and live. I'll be fine here." She woke to find dawn breaking over the mountains, the sky turning from black to deep blue to pale gold. Halito was already up, checking the horses and packing their gear. When he saw her stirring, he brought her a cup of coffee he'd somehow managed to brew over the rekindled fire.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
She took it gratefully, the bitter warmth chasing away the last of the night's chill. They were on the trail again within the hour, riding northeast across the plateau toward the distant mountains. The land here was different than the desert around Bitter Creek, more alive somehow, with patches of wildflowers pushing up through the grass and hawks circling overhead on thermal currents. Evelyn found herself breathing deeper, her shoulders loosening from the permanent hunch of defensive tension she'd carried for so long. Around midday, they came upon a sight that made Halito pull up short, his hand moving to the rifle across his saddle. Ahead, black smoke rose in a thick column against the blue sky. Too much smoke for a campfire, too steady for a grass fire. Something was burning, something big. "Stay close," Halito said, his voice tight. "And if I tell you to run, you run." "Understand," Evelyn nodded, her own hand moving to the knife Halito had given her that morning, a spare from his pack. They approached slowly, cautiously, following the smoke to its source. What they found made Evelyn's stomach turn. A wagon sat in the middle of the trail, or what was left of one. The canvas cover had burned away completely, the wooden frame was still smoldering. Around it, scattered in the grass, were the belongings of whoever had been traveling. Clothes, pots, a child's doll with its face scorched black. Halito dismounted and moved toward the wreckage, his rifle ready. Evelyn followed, scanning the area for any sign of the people who'd been here. She found them 20 yards from the wagon, a man and a woman, both dead. The man had been shot in the back, the woman's throat had been cut. Evelyn had seen death before, had washed her husband's body for burial, but this was different. This was murder, casual and cruel, raiders, Halito said, crouching beside the bodies. Probably the same ones who've been working this territory for months. They take what they want and leave nothing but corpses. He stood, his face hard. "We need to bury them and move on. If the raiders arrest Steele in the area, we don't want to be here when they come back." They spent the next hour digging shallow graves in the hard earth, using a folding spade from Halito's pack. It was brutal work under the sun, but neither complained. When the bodies were covered and marked with stones, Halito spoke a few words. In Choctaw, a prayer or blessing that Evelyn didn't understand but appreciated nonetheless. She added her own silent prayer, asking whoever might be listening to give these strangers peace. As they remounted and prepared to leave, Evelyn noticed something glinting in the grass near where the woman had fallen. She dismounted and picked it up, a small silver locket on a broken chain. Inside were 2 tiny portraits, a young couple smiling at the camera, probably taken on their wedding day. She showed it to Halito. "Should we bury this with them?" she asked. He shook his head. "Keep it. When we reach the settlement, we can try to find out who they were, if they have family who should know what happened. It's the least we can do." Evelyn tucked the locket into her pocket, the metal cold against her skin, even through the fabric. They rode hard after that, putting distance between themselves and the massacre site. The joy she'd felt that morning was gone, replaced by a grim awareness of just how dangerous this journey was. The land might be beautiful, but it was also deadly, and men with guns and no conscience roamed it freely. By evening they'd reached the foothills of the mountains, where pine trees began to appear among the scrub oak and juniper. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of resin and earth. Halito led them to a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock, protected from above and behind, with a clear view of the approaches. Defensive, Evelyn realized. He was choosing places they could defend if necessary. They made camp without speaking much, both of them thinking about what they'd seen. As darkness fell and the fire was built, Evelyn finally broke the silence. "How often does that happen?" she asked. "The raiders, the killing, too often," Halito said grimly. "There's no real law out here, no one to stop men who decide to take what they want. The army patrols sometimes, but they're spread thin, and most don't care what happens to settlers or natives. We're on our own." Evelyn stared into the fire, her hand unconsciously moving to the locket in her pocket. "We should have been able to help them," she said. "If we'd been there earlier, maybe," Halito interrupted her gently but firmly. "Don't do that. Don't carry guilt for things you couldn't control. We did what we could. We buried them with dignity, and we'll try to find their family. That's more than the raiders would have done. Sometimes that has to be enough." She knew he was right, but it didn't make the weight in her chest any lighter. She thought about the woman's face, peaceful in death, despite the violence that had taken her. She thought about how easily that could have been her own face if things had gone differently in Bitter Creek. The line between living and dying out here was so thin you could cut yourself on it without even noticing. That night, sleep was harder to find. Every sound made her start. Every shift of wind through the pines sounded like footsteps approaching. Halito seemed to sense her unease because he moved his bedroll closer to hers, close enough that she could hear his steady breathing, could take comfort in his presence. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I won't let anything happen to you." It was a promise he had no right to make, one he might not be able to keep, but somehow it helped. Evelyn closed her eyes, and eventually, exhaustion claimed her. She dreamed of smoke and silver lockets, of strangers' faces and distant mountains. And somewhere in those dreams, she heard Thomas's voice again, softer now, telling her to keep going, to trust the man who'd bought her freedom with $3 silver and asked nothing in return. When dawn came, they rose stiff and sore, ate a cold breakfast, and continued north. The mountains loomed closer now, their slopes dark with timber, their peaks sharp against the morning sky. Somewhere beyond them lay the valley Halito had spoken of, the Quaker settlement, where maybe, just maybe, two broken people could find a place to heal. But first they had to survive the journey, and after yesterday, both of them knew just how uncertain survival could be. The mountain pass was narrower than Evelyn had expected, barely wide enough for the horses to walk single file between walls of granite that seemed to lean inward as if trying to crush anything foolish enough to venture between them. Water trickled down the rock faces, leaving dark stains and patches of bright green moss that looked almost unnatural against the gray stone. The air was thin here, making each breath feel incomplete, and the temperature had dropped enough that Evelyn could see her breath misting in the early morning light. Halito moved ahead with careful deliberation, testing each section of path before committing his weight to it. Twice he dismounted to lead his horse over sections where a loose scree made the footing treacherous. Evelyn followed his example, her legs protesting the unfamiliar work of climbing, her hands raw from gripping the reins too tightly. She'd thought herself strong after surviving 3 years of widowhood and poverty. But this was a different kind of hardship, one that tested the body rather than just the spirit. By noon they'd climbed high enough that looking back made Evelyn's stomach lurch. The plateau they'd crossed stretched out below them like a vast brown ocean, and she could see for what must have been 50 miles in every direction. It was beautiful in a terrible way. All that emptiness, all that space where a person could vanish without a trace. She thought of the murdered couple they'd buried and wondered how many other graves marked that endless expanse. How many stories ended in shallow holes, covered with stones that no one would ever find. They stopped to rest where the pass widened slightly, creating a small flat area beside a stream that cascaded down from somewhere higher up the mountain. The water was so cold it made Evelyn's teeth ache when she drank, but it was clean and sweet, tasting of snowmelt and stone. Halito filled their canteens while she sat on a boulder, massaging her calves and trying not to think about how much farther they still had to climb. How much longer to the top, she asked, trying to keep the exhaustion from her voice. Halito glanced at the sun's position, then at the trail ahead. 3 hours if we don't have to backtrack. Then 2 more hours down the other side to reach flat ground. We'll camp in the valley tonight. He paused, studying her face. Can you make it? She wanted to snap at him, to tell him she wasn't some delicate flower that would wilt at the first sign of hardship, but the genuine concern in his voice stopped her. Instead, she just nodded. I can make it. I've come too far to turn back now. They pressed on, the trail growing steeper and more treacherous with each turn. In one place they had to dismount and lead the horses across a section where a rock slide had partially blocked the path, loose stones shifting underfoot with every step. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs as she inched across, one hand clutching Taya's reins, the other pressed flat against the rock wall, trying not to look at the drop to her right where the mountain simply fell away into nothing. When they finally reached the summit, the wind hit them like a physical force, cold and sharp and carrying the scent of pine forests far below. Evelyn stood at the highest point, looking out at a vista that stole what little breath the altitude had left her. The valley Halito had spoken of lay spread before them like a promised land, green and lush compared to the harsh country they'd crossed. A river snaked through it, catching the sunlight like a ribbon of silver, and she could see the dark squares of cultivated fields, the smoke from chimneys, the unmistakable signs of human habitation. There, Halito said, pointing to a cluster of buildings near the river. That's the settlement. 3 more hours and we'll be there. He turned to her, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Something that might have been relief or hope or perhaps just the loosening of tension he'd carried since Bitter Creek. We're going to make it, Evelyn. The descent was harder than the climb in different ways. Gravity pulling them forward, forcing them to lean back and trust their weight to legs already trembling with fatigue. Twice Evelyn's horse stumbled, and once she nearly went over its head when Taya's front hoof caught in a root hidden beneath fallen leaves. But Halito was there instantly, steadying both horse and rider with strong hands and calm words, and they continued down. As they dropped below the tree line, the forest closed around them like a green cathedral. Massive pines rose on all sides, their trunks straight as ship masts, their branches filtering the sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. Birds sang in the canopy above, and somewhere in the distance Evelyn heard the drumming of a woodpecker. It was so different from the harsh desert silence around Bitter Creek that for a moment she felt disoriented, as if she'd somehow crossed into a different world entirely. They reached the valley floor just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. The settlement was larger than it had appeared from above, perhaps 40 or 50 buildings arranged in a loose grid pattern, with the river forming a natural boundary on one side and fields stretching out on the other. As they rode closer, Evelyn could see people working in those fields, could hear the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the sound of children's laughter. A man spotted them first, straightening from his work in a vegetable garden to watch their approach. He was tall and thin, dressed in simple homespun clothes, his face weathered but kind. He set down his hoe and walked toward them, raising one hand in greeting. "Welcome, friends," he called out. "You look like you've traveled far." Halito dismounted, and Evelyn did the same, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit solid ground. "We have," Halito said. 3 weeks from Bitter Creek. This is Evelyn Townsend, and I'm Halito Pushmataha. We were hoping you might remember me. I passed through here 2 years ago, helped guide a group of settlers from Fort Smith." The man's face lit with recognition. "Of course, I remember. You're the Choctaw hunter who refused payment for your services. I'm Thomas Whitaker." He extended his hand and Halito shook it. Then he turned to Evelyn. "Mrs. Townsend, you're most welcome here. Both of you are. Come, you must be exhausted and hungry. My wife will have supper ready soon, and you can tell us what brings you to our valley." They followed Whitaker to a sturdy house built of logs and mud chinking, with real glass windows and a stone chimney. A woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her face open and curious. "Martha," Whitaker called, "we have guests. This is Halito, the guide I told you about, and Mrs. Townsend. They've come a long way." Martha Whitaker was a small woman with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She looked them both over quickly, taking in their dusty clothes and exhausted faces, then smiled warmly. "Well, you'll stay for supper and the night at least," she said firmly. "I won't hear any arguments. There's a wash basin around back and clean towels. Take your time, and when you're ready, come inside. We eat simple here, but there's plenty." The kindness in her voice, the casual assumption of hospitality without questions or conditions, nearly undid Evelyn completely. She felt tears threatening and had to look away, blinking hard. "Thank you," she managed to say. "You're very kind." While Halito tended to the horses, Evelyn went around back to the wash basin. The water was cold but clean, and there was a piece of lye soap that smelled of lavender. She scrubbed her face and hands, watching days of trail dust swirl away in the dirty water, and when she looked up, she caught her reflection in the window glass. The face staring back at her was thinner than she remembered, harder, with new lines around the eyes and mouth. But there was something else too, something she hadn't seen in a long time. She looked alive. Supper was a revelation. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, butter that was actually butter and not the rancid lard she'd grown accustomed to. Vegetable stew thick with potatoes and carrots and beans, and milk. Real milk from cows she could hear lowing in the barn outside. Evelyn had to force herself to eat slowly, to not fall on the food like a starving animal, but it was difficult. Across the table, she saw Halito doing the same. Both of them trying to maintain dignity while their bodies screamed for sustenance. The Whitakers asked no prying questions, content to let their guests eat in peace while they made gentle conversation about the settlement and the valley. There were 43 families here now, Thomas explained, all of them Quakers or those sympathetic to the faith's principles of peace and equality. They'd carved this community out of wilderness 5 years ago, and while life was hard, it was good. They had a school, a meeting house, a mill, and most importantly, they had each other. After supper, Martha showed Evelyn to a small room at the back of the house. "There's a real bed with clean sheets," she said, "and I've left one of my nightdresses on the chair. You're welcome to it if you'd like." Evelyn stared at the bed, at the quilts and pillows, at the simple luxury of a door that closed and a window with curtains. When was the last time she'd slept in a real bed, she wondered. Not since Thomas left for the war, certainly. She turned to Martha, emotion threatening to overwhelm her again. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "For your kindness, for not asking questions, for just letting us be human for a night." Martha reached out and squeezed her hand, her grip surprisingly strong for such a small woman. "We've all needed kindness from strangers at some point, dear. That's what community means, taking care of each other. Now get some rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough for whatever comes next." Alone in the room, Evelyn changed into the borrowed nightdress and climbed into bed. The mattress was stuffed with fresh straw and felt like heaven compared to the hard ground she'd been sleeping on. She thought she'd fall asleep immediately, but instead she lay there staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. What came next, Martha had said. What did come next? She had the land deed tucked safely in Halito's saddlebag. It entitled the bearer to 160 acres of territory land, earned by Thomas Townsend's service in the Union Army. But would it be valid here? in this valley that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of civilization. And if it was, what would she do with land? She didn't know how to farm anymore, hadn't worked soil in years. Could she build a life here, put down roots in a place where people seemed to actually care about each other? And what about Halito? He'd brought her here, had kept his word to see her safely to a place where the deed might mean something. But he'd never said he would stay. Why would he? She was just someone he'd bought at an auction, a stranger he'd felt obligated to help because of his own guilt over his wife's death. Once she was settled, or as settled as she could be, he'd probably move on. That was what men like him did, drifted from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots. The thought bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Somewhere over the past weeks, Halito had become more than just her rescuer or traveling companion. He'd become someone she trusted, someone whose presence made her feel safer than she'd felt in years. The idea of him leaving, of waking up one morning to find him gone, created an ache in her chest that she didn't want to examine too closely. She must have finally drifted off because the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the window and someone was knocking gently on her door. Evelyn sat up, disoriented for a moment, before Martha's voice called softly from the other side. "Mrs. Townsend, breakfast is ready when you are." There's no rush. Evelyn dressed quickly in her own clothes, which someone had washed and dried overnight, then joined the family in the main room. Halito was already there, looking more rested than she'd seen him. He nodded to her as she entered, and she thought she saw something warm in his eyes. Something that might have been gladness that she was there. Over breakfast of porridge and honey and more of that incredible fresh bread, Thomas Whitaker broached the subject they'd all been avoiding. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but what are your plans now that you're here? Are you looking to settle in the valley, or just passing through?" Evelyn glanced at Halito, unsure how to answer. He met her eyes, then turned to Thomas. "Mrs. Townsend has a land deed," he said. 160 acres earned by her late husband's military service. "We were hoping it might be valid here, that she could claim land in this valley and start again." Thomas set down his spoon, his expression thoughtful. "May I see the deed?" he asked. Halito retrieved it from his things and handed it over. Thomas studied it carefully, his wife reading over his shoulder. After a long moment, he nodded. "This is legitimate," he said. "And yes, it would be valid here. The valley is still mostly unclaimed territory. You'd need to register it properly with the territorial office, but that can be done." He looked up at Evelyn. "The question is, do you want to claim it? Land means responsibility, means putting down roots and committing to a place." Evelyn felt everyone's eyes on her. This was the moment, the decision point where her life could go in entirely different directions. She could claim the land, try to build something here in this valley among these kind strangers. Or she could take the deed and keep moving, trade it for cash somewhere, and disappear into the West like so many others fleeing their pasts. The safe choice would be to run, to not risk caring about a place or people again. But when had safe ever gotten her anywhere worth being? She straightened her shoulders and met Thomas Whitaker's gaze directly. "I want to claim it," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I want to try to build something here, if your community will have me." Thomas smiled, broad and genuine. "Then welcome home, Mrs. Townsend. Welcome home." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow in the best possible way. Home. She hadn't had a home in 3 years, just places she existed in while waiting to die or move on. But maybe, just maybe, she could have one again. She looked at Halito and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was that pride in his eyes or satisfaction at a job completed, or something else entirely? That afternoon, Thomas took them to meet the Council of Elders who helped govern the settlement. They were 5 in number, 3 men and 2 women, all of them older with faces marked by hard living and harder choices. They listened as Evelyn explained who she was, where she'd come from, and why she wanted to stay. They examined the land deed, passing it between them and discussing its validity in low voices. Finally, the eldest of them, a woman named Sarah with snow-white hair and eyes like chips of flint, spoke directly to Evelyn. This valley was founded on principles of peace, equality, and mutual support, she said. We don't care about your past, only about your willingness to be part of our future. If you claim land here, you'll be expected to contribute to the community, to help your neighbors when they need it, and to live according to our ways. Can you do that? Evelyn didn't hesitate. I can, she said. And I will, Sarah nodded, then turned her sharp gaze on Halito. And you, young man, will you be staying as well or moving on? The question hung in the air like smoke. Evelyn found herself holding her breath, waiting for his answer. Halito was quiet for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he said, I brought Mrs. Townsend here to give her a chance at a new life. That's done. What I do next is my own choice. It wasn't an answer, not really, but the elders seemed to accept it. Very well, Sarah said. Mrs. Townsend, your claim is approved. We'll help you survey the land and mark the boundaries. There's a piece along the river that's good soil and has access to water. It would suit your purpose as well. She paused, then added more gently, it's not easy, starting over. But we'll help you every step of the way. As they left the meeting house, Evelyn felt lighter than she had in years, as if some great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had land now, real land, and a community willing to help her build a life on it. It was more than she'd dared hope for when she stood on that auction platform in Bitter Creek. But when she looked for Halito, he'd already moved away. Standing at the edge of the settlement, looking north toward the mountains they'd crossed. She walked over to join him, following his gaze. What are you thinking? She asked quietly. He didn't look at her when he answered. I'm thinking that I've done what I set out to do. You're safe, you have a future here. My work is finished. The words should have been comforting, confirming that he'd kept his promise. Instead, they felt like a knife between her ribs. So you're leaving, she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. I don't know yet, he admitted. Part of me wants to stay, to see if I could build something here too. But another part remembers what happened last time I tried to settle down, tried to have a life. He finally turned to face her. I'm afraid, Evelyn. Afraid that if I stay, I'll bring my past down on this place, on these good people. On you. She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. Your past isn't who you are, she said firmly. It's just where you've been. These people don't care about that. And neither do I. Their eyes met and held. And in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. Halito covered her hand with his own, his calloused palm rough against her skin. Maybe you're right, he said softly. Maybe it's time to stop running. The land Evelyn claimed lay along a bend in the river where the water ran deep and slow, the soil dark and rich from centuries of flooding and renewal. Ancient cottonwoods lined the banks, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind, and beyond them stretched 40 acres of meadowgrass tall enough to hide a standing deer. Thomas Whitaker had been right. It was good land. Better than anything she'd dared imagine back in Bitter Creek when survival meant selling herself on an auction block. The community gathered on a bright morning to help her stake the boundaries. Men with surveying equipment marked the corners while women brought food and children ran through the grass like wild things, their laughter echoing across the valley. Halito worked alongside the others, driving stakes deep into the earth with methodical precision, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool breeze coming down from the mountains. Evelyn watched him between her own tasks, noting how easily he moved among these people, how they'd accepted him without question or judgment. By midday, the boundaries were set and the community shared a meal on blankets spread across the grass. Martha Whitaker had brought fried chicken and biscuits. Another family contributed fresh cheese and apples. And someone had even managed to produce a jug of apple cider that made the children's eyes light up with delight. Evelyn sat among them, still somewhat overwhelmed by the casual generosity. The way these people shared what little they had without expecting anything in return. A young woman with red hair and freckles sat down beside her, balancing a plate on her lap. "I'm Rebecca Carlson," she said with a warm smile. "My husband James and I have the property just east of yours. We've been here 2 years now, came from Pennsylvania after the war." She paused, her smile fading slightly. "I heard you lost your husband at Shiloh."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"I'm sorry, that was a terrible battle," Evelyn nodded, the old familiar ache settling in her chest. "It was. He died trying to save a field surgeon who'd been hit. Thomas always put others first, even when it cost him everything." Rebecca reached over and squeezed her hand. "Then he was a good man, and the world is poorer without him. But you're still here, still fighting, and that takes its own kind of courage. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you just come find me. We look after each other here." The simple kindness of it, offered without pity or condescension, brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. She blinked them back and managed a genuine smile. "Thank you. I'm not used to people caring what happens to me." "Well, you'd better get used to it," Rebecca said, with a laugh. "Because that's how we do things in this valley." She gestured toward where Halito stood talking with several men about timber cutting. "That one seems like good people, too." "Are you two?" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Traveling together, or..." Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He bought my freedom in Bitter Creek and brought me here so I could claim my land. I owe him my life, probably. But beyond that," she trailed off, unsure how to explain what existed between her and Halito, that strange bond forged through shared hardship and mutual understanding. Rebecca studied her with knowing eyes. "Sometimes the people who save us end up meaning more than we expect. Just don't wait too long to figure out what you really feel. Life's too short and too uncertain for that kind of hesitation." Before Evelyn could respond, a commotion erupted near the river. Children were shouting, pointing at something in the water, and several men were running toward the bank. Halito reached it first, not hesitating before plunging into the current fully clothed. Evelyn's heart lurched as she watched him disappear beneath the surface, then emerge pulling something. Someone, toward the shore. It was a boy. Perhaps 8 or 9 years old, coughing and sputtering but alive. His mother reached him as Halito laid him on the grass, her face white with terror. "Daniel," she gasped, clutching him to her chest. "Oh God, Daniel." Halito stood back, water streaming from his clothes, breathing hard. "He'll be fine," he said calmly. "Just swallowed some river, nothing more serious. The boy should learn to swim, though, and to respect the current. It's stronger than it looks." The mother looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said fervently. "Thank you for saving my son." Halito just nodded and walked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude. And Evelyn realized this was who he was, a man who saved people as naturally as breathing, who put himself at risk without thought because that's what his conscience demanded that evening. After the community had dispersed to their own homes and the sun was painting the mountains gold and crimson, Evelyn and Halito stood together on her new land, looking out at the river where it caught the last light. "This is yours now," he said quietly. "Everything you can see from here to those markers. You can build a life here, Evelyn, a real one." She turned to face him, her heart suddenly racing. "And what about you? Will you be here to see it? Or are you still planning to drift north and disappear like smoke?" He met her eyes and she saw the conflict in them, the war between what he wanted and what he believed he deserved. "I don't know if I'm capable of staying in one place anymore," he admitted. "After Ayana died, I swore I'd never put down roots again. Never let myself care about people or places because it hurts too much when they're taken away. But you've already stayed, she said, stepping closer. You've been here 3 days, and you've helped survey my land, saved a drowning child, and talked with half the community about everything from crop rotation to the best way to cure venison. You're not drifting anymore, Halito. You're already home, you just haven't admitted it yet. He reached up and touched her face, his hand gentle against her cheek. What if I bring danger here? What if my past catches up with me and puts you and these good people at risk? Then we'll face it together, she said firmly. That's what community means, isn't it? We protect each other. She covered his hand with her own. I'm not asking you to stay because I owe you. I'm asking because I want you here. Because somewhere between Bitter Creek and this valley, you became more to me than just the man who bought my freedom. The words hung between them, brave and terrifying. For a long moment, Halito said nothing, just looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then he leaned down and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper, and she felt 3 years of grief and loneliness begin to crack like ice in spring thaw. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I'll stay, he whispered. God help me. I'll stay, and we'll see if a man like me can learn to build instead of just survive. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of gunfire echoing across the valley. Both of them spun toward the settlement, where orange flames were beginning to lick at the sky, smoke rising in dark columns against the twilight. Halito's face went hard as stone. Raiders, he said, already running for the horses. Stay here, hide in the trees, like hell, Evelyn shot back, running beside him. That's my community now. I'm not hiding while they burn. They rode hard toward the settlement. Halito with his rifle ready, Evelyn with the pistol he'd given her the previous day, clutched tight in her hand. As they got closer, the chaos became clearer. A dozen men on horseback were tearing through the settlement, setting fire to buildings and shooting at anyone who showed resistance. The same raiders who'd murdered the couple on the trail, Evelyn realized with sickening certainty. Come to take what they wanted from people who believed in peace. Halito pulled up at the edge of town, quickly assessing the situation. The raiders were organized, working in pairs to cover each other while they looted. Most of the Quakers had taken shelter inside the meeting house, and the raiders were surrounding it, clearly planning to either flush them out or burn them inside. There, Halito pointed to where Thomas Whitaker stood in the doorway of his home, rifle in hand despite his faith's prohibition against violence. Protecting his wife and children, 3 raiders were converging on the Whitaker house. Halito raised his rifle and fired once, the shot taking the first raider in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The other 2 wheeled their horses around, searching for the shooter. Halito fired again, this time just over their heads. Leave, he shouted. Leave now or the next one won't miss. One of the raiders laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Well, boys, looks like we got us a hero. He raised his pistol toward where Halito and Evelyn sat their horses, but before he could fire, Evelyn's pistol cracked. The bullet caught him in the arm, making him drop his weapon with a curse. The second raider, seeing his companions wounded and facing unknown odds in the darkness, turned his horse and fled. But the remaining raiders, seeing resistance, became more vicious. The leader, a thick-set man with a scarred face and dead eyes, bellowed orders. Burn it all. Kill anyone who fights back. They're just Quaker trash anyway. Fire bloomed from multiple points as torches were thrown onto roofs. Women screamed, children cried, and men who dedicated their lives to peace found themselves facing violence they had no tools to combat. Halito rode into the center of it all, firing with precision, aiming to wound rather than kill, trying to drive the raiders back without becoming the murderer he'd sworn never to be again. Evelyn followed close, her heart hammering but her hands steady. She saw Rebecca's house catch fire and watched James Carlson trying desperately to haul buckets of water from the well. She rode to him, helping organize a bucket line while Halito kept the raiders at bay. Martha Whitaker emerged from her house with a rifle she clearly barely knew how to use. Her face set with determination that transcended her religious beliefs. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Gradually the raiders realized they faced more resistance than they'd expected, that their easy targets had teeth. When 2 more of their number fell wounded and the fire brigade managed to control most of the blazes, the scarred leader called a retreat. "This ain't over," he shouted toward the settlement. "We'll be back, and next time we'll finish what we started." They thundered away into the darkness, leaving behind destruction and terror, but mercifully few casualties. 1 man had been shot in the leg, several others had burns from fighting fires, and a young girl had been trampled by a horse, but by some miracle no one had died. The community emerged from shelter, stunned and shaking, staring at the smoking ruins of 3 buildings and the damaged walls of several others. Halito dismounted, his face grim. "They'll come back," he said to Thomas Whitaker, who stood surveying the damage with tears streaming down his face. "Men like that always come back. This valley is rich and you're peaceful, which makes you easy prey in their eyes." Thomas nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of impossible choices. "We don't believe in violence," he said quietly. "But tonight I fired a gun at another human being. I don't know how to reconcile that with my faith." "Your faith doesn't require you to let evil triumph," Evelyn said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Sometimes protecting the innocent means standing against those who would harm them. God gave us free will and judgment for a reason." Sarah, the elder woman who'd approved Evelyn's land claim, stepped forward. Her white hair was singed on one side and ash smudged her face, but her eyes were clear and hard as diamonds. "The girl speaks truth," she said. "We came here to build a community based on peace and equality, but we cannot let wolves devour the flock in the name of principle." She turned to Halito. "Can you teach us to defend ourselves without becoming like them?" Halito met her gaze, seeing in her the same strength he'd seen in Evelyn on that auction platform. "I can teach you to shoot, to stand guard, to protect what's yours. But the line between defense and aggression is thin, and once crossed, it's hard to find your way back. I know that better than anyone. Then you'll keep us on the right side of it," Sarah said with finality. "Starting tomorrow, you'll train anyone willing to learn. We'll organize watches, build defenses, prepare for when they return." She looked around at her community, at the frightened faces and smoking ruins. "We will not abandon our principles, but neither will we be sheep led to slaughter." The next 2 weeks transformed the valley. Halito became a reluctant teacher, showing men and women alike how to handle firearms, how to watch for approaching danger, how to coordinate defense without losing their humanity. Evelyn worked alongside him, her own skills with a pistol improving daily, her voice becoming one that others listened to when strategies were discussed. The community built a watchtower at the valley's entrance, organized rotating guard shifts, and stockpiled weapons and ammunition purchased from a trading post 2 days' ride north. It went against everything they'd believed in when they founded the settlement, but survival demanded adaptation. Some families, unable to reconcile violence with their faith, chose to leave, heading further west in search of some impossible peace. Most stayed, accepting that the world was darker than their ideals had allowed for. During those weeks, Evelyn's land claim moved from theory to reality. With Halito's help and that of several neighboring families, she began building a small cabin on the site she'd chosen, overlooking the river. It was hard work, cutting and hauling logs, notching them together, raising walls that would shelter her through the coming winter. Her hands blistered and bled, her back ached constantly. But she'd never felt more alive. Halito worked beside her every day. And at night they would sit by the fire talking about everything and nothing. Their conversations ranging from childhood memories to philosophical debates about justice and mercy. Slowly, cautiously, they were building something between them that neither dared name yet. something fragile and precious as new growth after fire. One evening, 3 weeks after the raid, they sat on the half-finished porch of her cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. The walls were up, the roof was on, and tomorrow they'd start on the interior. It was becoming real, this life she was building, this future she'd thought impossible in Bitter Creek. Halito reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her without speaking. Evelyn unwrapped it carefully, finding inside a carved wooden bird, exquisitely detailed, every feather visible. "It's a meadowlark," he said quietly. "The first bird I saw when I came to this valley 2 years ago. I carved it then, thinking maybe someday I'd have reason to give it to someone." To mark a new beginning, she turned the carving over in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship, the care evident in every cut of the knife. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." He took her hand, the carved bird still cradled between their palms. "Evelyn, I came to Bitter Creek thinking I could save someone the way I couldn't save Ayana. But somewhere along the trail, it stopped being about redemption and started being about you. About us. I don't know what the future holds, or if those raiders will come back, or if I'll ever fully escape my past. But I know I want to face it here, with you, if you'll have me." She set the bird carefully aside and turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "When you bought my freedom for $3 silver, I told you that you'd be sorry, that I wouldn't bow to you. And I haven't, have I?" He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "No, you haven't. You've been stubborn and fierce and brave beyond measure. You've challenged me and changed me in ways I didn't think possible." "Good," she said firmly. "Because I'm not done challenging you, Halito Pushmataha. We're going to build a life here, together. And it's going to be messy and hard and probably dangerous. But it will be ours, built on our terms. And no one, not raiders or ghosts or our own fears, will take it from us." He pulled her close, holding her against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "Then I guess you were right," he murmured into her hair. "I am sorry I bought you." She pulled back, ready to argue, but he was grinning. "Sorry because $3 was far too little for someone worth more than all the gold in California." She laughed and kissed him, tasting smoke and sweat and the promise of tomorrow. Around them, the valley settled into night, the community lights twinkling like earthbound stars, the river singing its eternal song. Somewhere in the darkness, danger still lurked, threats still waited. But for now, in this moment, there was only the two of them and the life they were choosing to build together. The scarred leader returned exactly 1 month after his first raid, bringing with him not a dozen men but nearly 30. A small army of the desperate and vicious drawn by promises of easy plunder. They came at dawn when the mist still clung to the valley floor and most of the settlement slept, believing the watch rotation would give them warning. But these raiders had learned from their previous defeat. Approaching through the forest on foot, leaving their horses a mile back, moving with a stealth that spoke of military training gone to rot. The first shot shattered the morning quiet, dropping the guard in the watchtower before he could ring the alarm bell. But Halito had anticipated this, had known that men like these would adapt their tactics. He'd placed secondary lookouts hidden in the trees, and one of them now fired 3 quick shots, the agreed signal for attack from the east. Within minutes, the settlement erupted into organized chaos. Families rushing to defensive positions they'd rehearsed dozens of times. Men and women alike taking up weapons with hands that shook but held steady. Evelyn grabbed her rifle from where it leaned beside her cabin door, her heart hammering but her mind clear. She'd been sleeping in her new home for only a week, the interior still sparse with just a bed and table, but it was hers, and she would defend it. Halito appeared from the tree line where he'd been on patrol, his face set in grim lines. "They're coming through the eastern forest," he said quickly. "At least 2 dozen, maybe more. They'll try to flank the meeting house again, trap everyone inside. Then we stop them before they reach it, Evelyn said, checking her ammunition. Rebecca and the others have their children in there. We don't let those animals near them. Halito gripped her shoulder briefly, a gesture of solidarity and something deeper. Stay low, aim true, and if it goes bad, you run for the river. Promise me. She met his eyes, seeing in them the fear of losing someone else he cared about, the terror of history repeating itself. I promise, she lied, knowing she would never run while he still fought, while any of her community still needed her. He seemed to read the truth in her face but didn't argue. Just nodded and moved toward the defensive positions they'd built. Low stone walls and wooden barriers that would provide cover. The raiders emerged from the mist like specters, spreading out in a practiced formation that spoke of coordinated planning. The scarred leader was among them, his dead eyes scanning the settlement with cold calculation. He raised his hand and shouted in order, and the attack began in earnest. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the sound deafening in the early morning air. Smoke mixing with mist to create a hellish fog. Thomas Whitaker stood behind an overturned wagon, firing with methodical precision, each shot a prayer and a curse combined. Beside him, Martha loaded spare rifles, her hands moving with automatic efficiency, despite the tears streaming down her face. Sarah commanded a group of younger defenders near the mill, her voice sharp and clear above the chaos. Hold your positions. Don't waste ammunition. Wait for clean shots. Evelyn found herself behind the stone wall of the half-built school. James Carlson on one side and a young man named Peter on the other. She fired at a raider trying to circle toward the meeting house, saw him stumble and fall, and felt sick even as she knew it was necessary. This was survival now, not murder. The protection of innocence against those who recognized no law but their own greed. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. The raiders were better armed and more numerous, but the settlers had position and motivation. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very right to exist in peace. Slowly, grudgingly, the raiders began to realize this would not be the easy victory they'd anticipated. Bodies lay scattered across the settlement, both raiders and defenders, the price of violence paid in blood and screaming. Then everything changed when a bullet found Thomas Whitaker. He'd stepped from behind cover to help a wounded defender, and a raider's shot caught him in the chest. He fell without a sound, and Martha's scream cut through the gunfire like a knife through silk. She ran to him despite the danger, cradling his head in her lap, her prayers mixing with his labored breathing. Halito saw it happen, and his face transformed into something terrible to behold. He rose from cover and advanced on the raiders with a fury that seemed to draw the very air from the valley. His rifle barked again and again, each shot precise and deadly, no longer aiming to wound, but to stop. The scarred leader saw him coming and raised his own weapon, but Halito was faster. The shot took the raider leader in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. Halito was on him in seconds, his knife drawn, pressing the blade against the man's throat. "Give the order to retreat," he said, his voice cold as winter death. "Or I paint this ground with you and every man who followed you." The scarred leader looked into Halito's eyes and saw his own mortality reflected there. He called out in a voice made weak by pain and fear. "Fall back, retreat, it's over." The remaining raiders, seeing their leader defeated and having lost nearly a third of their number, broke and ran for the forest. A few defenders wanted to pursue, to finish what had been started, but Sarah's voice rang out strong and commanding. "Let them go," she ordered. "We are not executioners. We defend, but we do not hunt." The silence that followed the raiders' departure was somehow worse than the gunfire had been. The valley filled with the sounds of mourning and pain, wounded crying out for help, women weeping over fallen husbands and sons, children calling for parents who would never answer. Thomas Whitaker died in Martha's arms as the sun broke through the mist. his last words a whispered prayer for forgiveness and peace. Evelyn found Halito standing over the scarred leader who lay bleeding but alive. His knife still in hand, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. She touched his arm gently. "It's over," she said softly. "Let the law deal with him now." "What law?" Halito asked bitterly. "We're 3 weeks from the nearest marshal. By the time anyone with authority arrives, he could have escaped or bled out. Justice out here is what we make it. Then we make it with mercy," Evelyn said firmly. "We tie him up, we tend his wounds enough to keep him alive, and when the marshal does come, we hand him over for trial. We don't become like him, Halito. That's not who we are." He looked at her for a long moment, then at the knife in his hand, then at the man who'd brought death to their valley twice now. Finally, slowly, he sheathed the blade. "You're right," he said heavily. "God help me, you're right." He called for rope and bandages, and together they secured the raider leader. Ignoring his curses and threats, the day that followed was the hardest Evelyn had ever lived through. And she'd buried a husband and survived destitution. 5 defenders had died, Thomas among them, and twice that many were wounded badly enough to need constant care. The meeting house became a hospital, every available space filled with pallets and blankets, the air thick with the smell of blood and laudanum. Women who'd never seen violence before now worked as nurses, holding down screaming patients while bullets were extracted, stitching wounds with trembling hands. Evelyn worked alongside them until exhaustion made her hands shake too badly to be useful, then stumbled outside for air. She found Halito sitting alone near the river, his rifle across his knees, staring at nothing. She sat beside him without speaking, just letting her presence be comfort enough. After a long silence, he spoke. "I've killed 6 men today," he said flatly. 6 souls sent to judgment by my hand. I told myself I was defending the innocent, protecting my community, but their faces will haunt me until I die. She took his hand, holding it tight between both of hers. "You saved lives today," she said. "How many children still have fathers because you stood between them and those raiders? How many women still have husbands? You can't carry the guilt of necessary violence, Halito. It will destroy you." "Ayana used to say something similar," he said quietly. "She told me that warriors who defend their people are blessed by the spirits, that there's honor in standing between the weak and those who would harm them. But I watched her die because I wasn't there when she needed me, and now Thomas is dead even though I was here. What good is a warrior who can't protect anyone that matters?" Evelyn turned his face toward hers, making him meet her eyes. "Thomas died protecting someone else, making a choice that honored everything he believed in. That's not your failure, it's his triumph. And as for your wife, she was taken by evil men who made evil choices. You've spent 5 years trying to atone for something that was never your sin to carry." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "How do I let it go? How do I forgive myself?" "You start by accepting that you're human," she said gently. "That you can't save everyone no matter how hard you try. And then you honor those you've lost by living the best life you can. By building something good in their memory instead of destroying yourself with guilt." He pulled her close, burying his face in her shoulder. And she felt his body shake with silent sobs. She held him through it, this man who'd saved her and taught her strength, now needing her strength in return. That was what love meant, she realized, not just being saved, but being strong enough to save in return. To catch each other when falling became inevitable. The weeks that followed were dedicated to healing and rebuilding. Thomas Whitaker was buried on a hillside overlooking the valley he'd helped found, and Martha spoke at his funeral with a voice that trembled but held steady. "He believed in peace until his dying breath," she said, "but he also believed in protecting the innocent. He made his choice, and I honor it, even as my faith struggles to understand it." The other fallen defenders were buried beside him, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses and wildflowers gathered by grieving children. The scarred raider leader was handed over to a territorial marshal who arrived 2 weeks later, along with a small detachment of soldiers. The man would stand trial for murder, robbery, and countless other crimes. The marshal also brought news that several other raider groups had been broken up across the territory, that the tide was slowly turning toward law and order. It was cold comfort to those who'd lost loved ones, but it was something. As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Evelyn's cabin became a home. Halito moved in with her blessing, and together they furnished it with pieces made by their own hands and contributions from neighbors who believed in their future. The community, scarred but not broken, began planning a proper wedding for them. A celebration of life and love in defiance of death and violence. On a crisp October morning with the first frost silvering the grass, Evelyn Townsend and Halito Pushmataha stood before the community in the rebuilt meeting house. Sarah performed the ceremony, speaking words about courage and commitment, about choosing love even when the world offered reasons for hate. Martha Whitaker stood in the front row, tears streaming down her face but smiling because Thomas would have wanted this, would have celebrated the triumph of hope over despair. When Sarah asked if they would honor and cherish each other through all hardships, Evelyn looked at Halito and remembered that day on the auction platform, remembered her defiant words. "You'll be sorry, I won't bow to you," she'd said, believing freedom meant never depending on anyone. But she'd learned that true freedom came from choosing who to stand beside, from building something together that neither could build alone. "I will," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the meeting house. "Not because I bow to you, but because I choose to stand with you." Halito smiled, that rare expression that transformed his usually serious face. "And I will honor and cherish you," he said. "Not because I bought your freedom, but because you taught me what freedom really means." They kissed as husband and wife while the community erupted in applause and celebration, the sound echoing across the valley like a declaration of victory over everything that had tried to break them. Outside, the river continued its eternal song. The mountains stood unchanging in their majesty, and the land they'd claimed together waited for the life they would build upon it. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under the stars. Children ran wild with excitement, old wounds were momentarily forgotten, and for one perfect night the valley knew peace without fear. Evelyn danced with her husband, his arms strong around her, and looked at the faces surrounding them. This community that had taken them in and made them family later. As the party wound down and guests departed to their own homes, Evelyn and Halito walked back to their cabin hand in hand. The moon was full and bright, turning the valley silver, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled its lonely song. But tonight it didn't sound lonely, it sounded wild and free, like a celebration of survival inside their home. Halito built up the fire while Evelyn changed out of her wedding dress into something more comfortable. She found the carved meadowlark he'd given her months ago, sitting on the mantel where she'd placed it, and picked it up, running her fingers over the smooth wood. So much had changed since he'd given this to her, so much pain and joy and transformation. He came to stand beside her, looking at the carving. "Do you remember what I said when I gave you that? About new beginnings," she nodded. "I remember. And this is our beginning, isn't it? Not back in Bitter Creek when you paid $3 for a stubborn widow. Not on the trail when we learned to trust each other. But right now tonight, when we choose this life together." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Every day is a new beginning if we choose to see it that way," he said. "Every sunrise is another chance to build something good." She turned in his arms to face him. "Then let's build something extraordinary," she said. "A life worth all the struggles it took to get here. A home where our children will grow up knowing they're loved. A legacy that proves love is stronger than hate, that hope can survive even in the darkest times." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. "We'll build it together," he promised. "Every day, every choice, every challenge. We'll face it side by side." They stood there in the firelight. Two people who'd been broken by life and remade by each other, holding tight to the future they'd claimed from the ashes of their pasts. Outside, the valley slept peacefully, guards rotating on their watch but no longer expecting attack. The raiders had been broken, the community had proven its strength, and morning would bring new work and new possibilities. As they finally climbed into bed, exhausted but happy, Evelyn thought about that woman who'd stood on an auction platform in Bitter Creek, defiant and terrified and certain she had nothing left to lose. That woman had been right to refuse to bow, but she'd been wrong about one thing. She had everything to gain: a home, a community, a love deeper than she'd imagined possible, and a future worth fighting for. Halito pulled her close, and she listened to his heartbeat, steady and sure, the rhythm of a life committed to hers. Tomorrow they would wake and begin the work of living, of tending their land and supporting their community and facing whatever challenges came. But tonight they were simply two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd chosen each other when the world offered them nothing but hardship. The fire burned low and the moon set beyond the mountains, and in the darkness before dawn, Evelyn Townsend Pushmataha whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever power had brought them through the wilderness to this moment. She'd been bought for $3 silver and a stranger's conscience, but she'd won something infinitely more valuable, a life lived on her own terms, with a man who saw her strength and loved her for it. As sleep finally claimed her, wrapped in warmth and safety and love, her last thought was simple and profound. She'd told Halito he would be sorry for buying her, that she wouldn't bow to him. She'd been both right and wrong. He wasn't sorry, and she'd never bowed, but she had learned to stand beside him, which was infinitely better than standing alone. And in that partnership, that choice to build rather than merely survive, they'd found something worth more than all the gold in California. 6 months had transformed the valley in ways both visible and profound. Spring had arrived with an explosion of wildflowers that carpeted the meadows in purple and gold, and the river ran high with snowmelt from the mountains, its voice a constant song of renewal. The scars from the raider attack had healed slowly but thoroughly. Burned buildings replaced with new structures that stood stronger than before, and the graves on the hillside were now surrounded by carefully tended gardens where Martha Whitaker could be found most mornings, talking to her husband as if he merely traveled and would return soon. Evelyn stood in the doorway of her cabin, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, watching Halito work in the field they'd cleared together over the winter months. He was planting corn in neat rows, his movements efficient and practiced, pausing occasionally to wipe sweat from his brow despite the cool morning air. She smiled, thinking about how this man who'd once believed himself incapable of staying in one place had become the most rooted person she knew, committed not just to the land but to the life they were building upon it. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where Rebecca Carlson rode up on her mar, a basket balanced carefully in front of her. Evelyn waved and walked out to meet her friend, moving more slowly than she once had, her body adjusting to the changes pregnancy brought. Rebecca dismounted with a grin, handing over the basket. "Fresh bread and some of that honey James harvested yesterday," she said. "And I brought the yarn you asked for. Enough to knit at least 3 baby blankets if you're feeling ambitious." Evelyn accepted the basket gratefully, gesturing for Rebecca to follow her inside. "You're too generous," she said. "I'll never be able to repay all the kindness you and James have shown us." Rebecca laughed as they entered the cabin, now furnished with a proper table and chairs, shelves lined with books borrowed from the community library, and a rocking chair Halito had built specifically for the baby's arrival. "That's not how community works, and you know it," she said, settling into one of the chairs. You and Halito have given just as much, maybe more. Who organized the new irrigation system that doubled our crop yields? Who trains the watch rotation every week to keep us safe? Who delivered Sarah's grandson when the midwife was delayed by flooding? Evelyn blushed slightly at the praise. That was Halito mostly, she protested. I just helped. You're a team, Rebecca said firmly. That's the point. And this community is stronger for having you both in it. She paused, her expression growing more serious. Speaking of which, there's news from the territorial office. The marshal sent word that the trial concluded. The raider leader was sentenced to hang, and most of his surviving men got 20 years hard labor. It's over, Evelyn. Really over. Evelyn sank into the rocking chair, one hand instinctively moving to her belly where new life grew, a counterpoint to all the death that had come before. I thought I'd feel more satisfaction hearing that, she admitted. But mostly I just feel tired. Tired of violence and vengeance and the whole cycle of it. That means you're healing, Rebecca said gently. You're letting go of anger and choosing peace. That's harder than holding on to rage, but it's also what lets us move forward. She gestured toward Evelyn's belly. That baby is going to grow up in a world where justice exists, where communities protect each other, where love matters more than hate. That's your victory, through the window. They watched Halito finish his planting and start walking toward the cabin, probably drawn by the sight of Rebecca's horse and curious about news. When he entered, his face was streaked with dirt, but his smile was genuine. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for so long finally faded to something softer. Rebecca, he greeted warmly. To what do we owe the pleasure? Just bringing supplies and gossip, Rebecca said with a grin. And to remind you both that the spring celebration is next week. Everyone's expected to attend, including pregnant women who think they're too busy to have fun. She gave Evelyn a pointed look that made them all laugh after Rebecca left. Evelyn and Halito shared a simple lunch of bread and cheese and early vegetables from their garden. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that came from knowing each other so well that words became optional. Finally, Evelyn spoke. She told me about the trial verdict. The raider leader is going to hang. Halito set down his food, his expression thoughtful. Good, he said simply. Not because I want him dead, but because justice needed to be seen. Those families who lost loved ones needed to know that their sacrifice mattered, that there are still consequences for cruelty. He reached across the table to take her hand. But I'm glad we don't have to be the ones to execute that justice. We've shed enough blood. She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses earned through honest labor, so different from the scars of violence that marked them both. Have you thought about names? She asked, changing the subject to something lighter. For the baby, his face softened in that way it only did when he thought about their coming child. If it's a girl, I was thinking Ayana, he said quietly. To honor my first wife, to let her memory be part of our future instead of just a ghost in my past. And if it's a boy, maybe Thomas, for the man who gave us a chance when we needed it most. Tears pricked Evelyn's eyes, not from sadness but from the profound rightness of those choices. Ayana Townsend Pushmataha, she said, testing the name. Or Thomas Townsend Pushmataha. Either way, they'll carry the legacy of people who believed in something better. She paused, then added with a slight smile. Though if you're naming our children after the dead, I reserve the right to saddle them with ridiculous middle names to balance it out. Halito laughed, the sound filling their small home with warmth. Deal, he said. As long as one of those middle names is stubborn, in honor of their mother. That afternoon they walked together through the valley, greeting neighbors working their own fields, stopping to admire new construction projects and baby animals born during the spring season. The community had grown by 3 families since the attack, word spreading of a place where people of all backgrounds could build lives without fear of persecution. The valley was becoming something rare in the territories, a genuine refuge built on principles that actually mattered. They ended their walk at the graves on the hillside, where Evelyn laid wildflowers on Thomas Whitaker's marker, while Halito stood silently beside her. "Thank you," she whispered to the earth, "for giving us a chance, for believing we could be better than our worst moments. Your faith in people wasn't misplaced." As they turned to leave, Martha appeared on the path below, carrying her own flowers. She saw them and waved, her smile sad but genuine. She'd aged visibly since Thomas's death, but there was strength in her still, the kind forged through surviving the unsurvivable. They met halfway down the hill, and Martha embraced them both. "I heard about the baby," she said warmly. "Thomas would have been so pleased. He always said this valley needed children, needed proof that life goes on." Evelyn felt tears threatening again. Seemed all she did these days was cry at the slightest provocation. "We're naming him Thomas if it's a boy," she managed to say. "We wanted you to know." Martha's composure cracked, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Oh, my dear girl," she whispered. "Oh, my dear, dear children." That would have meant the world to him. "It means the world to me." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "Now you stop making this old woman cry and go home. Rest, both of you. You've earned whatever peace this world can offer." That evening, as the sun painted the mountains in shades of fire and the valley settled into its evening rhythms, Evelyn and Halito sat on their porch watching the day end. She leaned against him, his arms solid around her shoulders, and thought about the journey that had brought them here. From an auction platform in a dying town to this place of genuine community, from strangers bound by circumstance to partners bound by choice. "Do you ever think about Bitter Creek?" she asked quietly. "About where we'd be if things had gone differently?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "And every time I do, I'm grateful for the path we took instead, as hard as it was." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You told me I'd be sorry for buying you. Were you right?" She considered the question seriously. "In a way, maybe. You've had to fight and kill and compromise your principles. You've taken on responsibilities you never asked for. You're tied to a place and people in ways that limit your freedom. So yes, in those ways, perhaps you should be sorry, but," he prompted, hearing the unspoken continuation. "But you've also found home," she said. "You've built something lasting, loved and been loved in return. You're going to be a father. And you've proven that the past doesn't have to define the future, that redemption is real if you're willing to work for it. So no, I don't think you're sorry. I think you're exactly where you're meant to be." He pulled her closer, and they sat in silence as stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the valley, a mother sang her child to sleep. Somewhere else, the watch changed shifts with quiet efficiency, and everywhere, people who'd chosen to stand together against the darkness settled into their homes, secure in the knowledge that they weren't alone. When they finally went inside and prepared for bed, Evelyn caught Halito looking at the carved meadowlark on the mantel, the symbol of new beginnings he'd given her so long ago. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking that I bought your freedom for $3 silver," he said slowly, "but you gave me mine for free. You taught me that being strong doesn't mean being alone, that building matters more than surviving, and that love is worth every risk it requires. So if anyone should be grateful, it's me." She crossed to him and took his hands, placing them gently on her belly where their child grew. "We saved each other," she said firmly. "That's the truth of it. Now stop being philosophical and come to bed. Your child is using my ribs as a ladder, and I need you to talk sense into them." His laugh followed them into their bedroom, and as they settled into sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, the valley breathed peacefully around them. The land they'd claimed together would feed them. The community they'd joined would support them. And the love they'd chosen would sustain them through whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Evelyn's last thought before sleep claimed her was simple but profound. She'd been bought at auction, broken by loss, and certain her life was over. But instead she'd found that endings could become beginnings. That the people who save us often need saving themselves. And that sometimes the best revenge against a cruel world is building something beautiful in spite of it. In the darkness, Halito tightened his arms around her and whispered words in Choctaw that she didn't need to understand to feel their meaning. They were promises and prayers and gratitude all woven together, offered to whatever spirits watched over people who refused to give up hope. And in the spring morning that would follow, they would wake and begin again, tending their land and their community and each other, building with every choice and every day a life worth the journey it had taken to find it.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.